The morning of October 15, 2007, began like any other Tuesday in the quiet suburbs of Cedar Falls, Iowa. Margaret Chin had already prepared her usual cup of coffee and was watching the early news when she heard the familiar jingle of collar tags approaching the kitchen. Max, her golden retriever, padded across the linoleum floor with the patient dignity of a dog who knew breakfast was coming, his amber eyes reflecting 16 years of unwavering loyalty and the gentle wisdom that comes with age. If this reminds you of someone you once knew, a faithful companion whose absence still echoes in the quiet corners of your heart, share this story with them. Some bonds transcend time itself. Margaret had rescued Max from a shelter when he was barely 2 years old, and now, at 18, he moved with the careful deliberation of a senior dog whose joints spoke of long walks through changing seasons and countless games of fetch in the backyard. His golden coat had faded to cream around his muzzle, and his once bright eyes had grown cloudy with cataracts, but his spirit remained as gentle and trusting as the day she'd first brought him home. The routine was sacred between them. Every morning at 7:30, regardless of weather, Margaret would clip Max's worn leather leash to his collar, and they would make their way down Maple Street toward Riverside Park. The neighborhood knew them well. The elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her faithful companion who stopped to greet every familiar face with a tail wag that spoke of simple joy. That morning carried the crisp promise of autumn. The maple trees lining their street had begun their transformation, painting the sidewalks with scattered leaves and shades of amber and rust. Margaret pulled her cardigan closer as they walked, noting how Max's pace had slowed considerably over the past few months. Dr. Williamson had been honest during their last visit. Max's heart was weakening, and their time together was becoming more precious with each passing day. "Just a little further, boy," she whispered as they approached the park's entrance. Max's tail gave a weak but determined wag, as if he understood that these morning walks were as much for her peace of mind as they were for his exercise. The park stretched before them like a canvas painted in morning light. Dew clung to the grass, creating tiny prisms that caught the early sun, and the old oak trees stood sentinel over the walking path they'd traveled together hundreds of times. Margaret unclipped Max's leash near their usual spot by the pond, watching as he moved slowly toward the water's edge, his reflection rippling in the gentle current. She settled onto their familiar bench, the same one where she'd sat every morning for nearly 16 years, and opened the paperback novel she'd been reading. The sounds of the awakening park surrounded her, the distant hum of traffic, the calls of geese overhead, the gentle lapping of water against the dock. Max wandered a few yards away, sniffing at the base of a willow tree with the methodical curiosity that had never left him despite his age. When Margaret looked up from her book 20 minutes later, expecting to see Max's familiar form by the water, she found only empty space. "Max," she called, her voice carrying a note of concern. The golden retriever was nowhere to be seen. She stood, scanning the park with growing urgency. Max had never wandered far, never ignored her calls, never disappeared from sight without reason. "Max," she called louder now, her voice echoing across the still water. A jogger paused, looking around with concern, but the park remained stubbornly empty of the golden shape she desperately sought. Margaret spent the next 3 hours searching. She walked every path, called his name until her voice grew hoarse, asked every person she encountered if they'd seen an elderly golden retriever. The park manager helped organize an impromptu search party, and by noon, 20 volunteers were combing through the surrounding neighborhoods, calling Max's name and posting hastily printed flyers on telephone poles. But Max had vanished as completely as morning mist, leaving behind only the echo of collar tags that seemed to linger in Margaret's memory like a ghost of routine. The days that followed, blurred together in a haze of searching and hoping. Margaret posted flyers throughout Cedar Falls, contacted every veterinary clinic within a 50-mile radius, and spent her savings on a reward that grew larger with each passing week. She drove slowly through neighborhoods she'd never seen before, windows down, calling his name until her throat was raw. The local newspaper ran Max's story, complete with his photograph, a picture Margaret had taken just weeks before his disappearance, showing him sitting patiently in a patch of autumn sunlight, his graying muzzle turned toward the camera with the patient expression of a dog who trusted that his human would always keep him safe. As autumn deepened into winter, and winter gave way to spring, the active search efforts gradually diminished. Well-meaning friends and neighbors stopped asking for updates. The flyers, weathered by rain and sun, began to fade and tear. But Margaret never stopped looking. Every morning, she walked their old route through Riverside Park, hoping against hope that she might see a familiar golden shape waiting by the pond. The empty house grew quieter with each passing season. Max's food bowls remained in their corner of the kitchen, his favorite tennis ball still sat on the living room windowsill, and his bed lay undisturbed beside Margaret's own. She couldn't bring herself to put away the reminders of their life together, clinging to the possibility that he might somehow find his way home. Years passed. Margaret's hair grew whiter, her steps slower, but her hope never completely died. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would swear she could hear the faint jingle of collar tags coming from another room, only to find the sound was nothing more than wind chimes on the porch or the settling of old house bones. The mystery of Max's disappearance became one of those neighborhood stories that people tell in hushed tones. How an old dog vanished without a trace, how his devoted owner never gave up searching, how love persists even in the face of inexplicable loss. Children who had been too young to remember grew up hearing about Margaret and Max, their story becoming part of the local folklore that binds communities together through shared sorrow and enduring hope. But on that October morning in 2007, as Margaret stood in the empty park calling Max's name while the autumn sun climbed higher in the sky, she couldn't have known that their story was far from over, that 16 years later, a child's curiosity would unlock a secret that had been hidden in plain sight, or that the truth about Max's disappearance would prove both more heartbreaking and more hopeful than anyone could have imagined. By 2015, Margaret Chen had learned to carry her grief like a quiet companion. 8 years had passed since Max disappeared, and she had slowly, reluctantly begun to accept that her golden retriever was gone forever. The missing dog posters had long since been removed from telephone poles and community bulletin boards, their edges curled and colors faded by seasons of Iowa weather. Yet in the quiet moments of her daily routine, Margaret still found herself listening for the gentle jingle of collar tags that would never come. The house on Maple Street had grown too large for one person, its rooms echoing with memories of happier times. Margaret's children, now grown with families of their own, had begun the gentle campaign that adult children wage when they worry about their aging parents living alone. During Sunday dinners and weekly phone calls, they spoke carefully about assisted living communities and the benefits of having neighbors close by. Margaret listened with the patience of someone who had learned to navigate these conversations without causing unnecessary worry, but she wasn't ready to leave the home where she and Max had shared so many quiet mornings and peaceful evenings. The neighborhood around her had changed subtly over the years. Young families moved in where elderly couples once lived, bringing with them the sounds of children playing and the sight of bicycles scattered across driveways. Margaret found unexpected comfort in watching these families establish their own routines, their own sacred patterns of daily life. She would wave to the new residents from her porch, sometimes sharing stories about the old days when she was asked, but more often simply existing as a gentle fixture of continuity in a world that seemed to shift faster with each passing year. One family in particular had caught her attention. The Hendersons had moved into the Blue House 3 streets over in 2012, bringing with them twin boys who were 8 years old and full of the boundless energy that comes with childhood summers. Margaret would sometimes see them riding their bikes past her house, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze like music from another lifetime. The mother, Linda Henderson, had introduced herself shortly after moving in, and had listened with genuine sympathy when Margaret mentioned her missing dog. "I can't imagine," Linda had said, her hand resting gently on Margaret's arm as they stood in the grocery store checkout line. "Our dog is like family. If something happened to Cooper, the boys would be devastated." Margaret had smiled and nodded, though the comparison made her heart ache in ways she couldn't easily express. Cooper, she learned, was a young German shepherd who had bounded into the Henderson family's life with all the exuberance of youth. The boys, Jake and Tyler, were devoted to him, and Margaret would sometimes see them in their backyard, throwing tennis balls while Cooper raced back and forth with inexhaustible enthusiasm. The sight of their play brought back echoes of her own memories with Max, but instead of bitterness, Margaret found herself feeling grateful that, somewhere in the neighborhood, the timeless bond between children and their beloved pet was being written in new chapters. She began to look forward to these glimpses of the Henderson family's happiness, finding in their joy a small measure of peace with her own loss. Dr. Williamson, Max's veterinarian, had retired in 2013, selling his practice to a younger woman who specialized in large animals. Margaret had stopped by once to meet the new owner, partly out of curiosity and partly out of hope that, somehow, someday, Max might turn up at the clinic where he'd received his annual checkups for so many years. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been kind and professional, pulling Max's old records and assuring Margaret that if anyone brought in a golden retriever matching his description, she would call immediately. "Even after all these years?" Margaret had asked. "Especially after all these years," Dr. Martinez had replied. "Dogs have been known to find their way home from incredible distances, sometimes decades after disappearing. Hope is never misplaced when it comes to the bond between a person and their pet." The words had stayed with Margaret as she drove home that day, settling in her heart like a small flame that refused to be extinguished. She began to visit the park again, not every morning as she once had, but on Sundays when the weather was pleasant and her spirit felt strong enough to walk the paths she and Max had traveled together. The park had changed too. The old willow tree by the pond had been damaged in a storm and removed, replaced by a young maple that cast thin shadows and had not yet grown into the majesty of its predecessor. New benches had been installed along the walking path, and a small memorial garden had been planted near the entrance to honor pets that had brought joy to the community. Margaret had considered adding Max's name to the bronze plaque that listed beloved animals, but something held her back. A stubborn refusal to declare him definitively gone when so many questions remained unanswered. On quiet Sunday mornings, sitting on the bench where she and Max had spent countless peaceful hours together, Margaret would close her eyes and try to remember every detail of their last morning together. Had he seemed different? Had there been signs she'd missed? The memory played in her mind like a film reel, always ending with the same devastating moment when she'd looked up from her book to find nothing but empty space where her faithful companion should have been. Sometimes other dog owners would approach her on these solitary walks, drawn by the unmistakable sadness of someone visiting a place that held deep significance. They would share their own stories of beloved pets, creating an impromptu communion of people who understood that the love between human and animal transcends ordinary categories of affection. These conversations always ended the same way, with promises to keep an eye out for Max, even though everyone understood that after so many years, the likelihood of his return had faded to nearly nothing. Margaret had learned to live with uncertainty, to carry love without the object of that love being present, to find meaning in the act of remembering itself. She kept Max's collar and leash in a drawer by the front door, along with his favorite toy and the vaccination certificates that documented a lifetime of responsible care. These objects had become talismans of a relationship that death or disappearance could not diminish. Her routine had evolved around the absence, rather than trying to fill it. She woke each morning still expecting to hear collar tags, still caught herself buying dog treats at the grocery store, still found comfort in the rhythms that she and Max had established together. The grief had become less sharp over time, transforming from acute pain into a gentle melancholy that colored her days without overwhelming them. But in the quiet corners of her heart, Margaret Chen still listened for the sound of coming home. The autumn of 2018 brought changes to Maple Street that Margaret noticed with the keen awareness of someone whose world had grown smaller and more precious over the years. The Martinez family had moved into the white colonial house directly across from her own, filling the previously quiet property with the sounds of domestic life that had been absent since the elderly Kowalski couple moved to Florida 3 years earlier. David and Rosa Martinez had arrived with their 7-year-old son, Danny, whose curiosity seemed to match his endless energy. Margaret watched from her front porch as they unpacked moving boxes, noting the careful way Rosa arranged flower pots on their front steps, and how David methodically inspected every corner of the small detached garage that sat at the back of their property. The boy, Danny, explored every inch of the yard with the thorough investigation that only children possess, peering under bushes, climbing the old apple tree, and discovering treasures in places where adults saw only ordinary landscape. Within a week of their arrival, Rosa Martinez knocked on Margaret's door with a plate of homemade tamales and the kind of genuine smile that instantly puts people at ease. She was a nurse at Cedar Falls Regional Hospital, she explained, working the day shift, while David managed a small construction company that specialized in home renovations. They had moved to Iowa from Phoenix when David's company expanded, drawn by the promise of small-town life and better schools for Danny. "Your yard is beautiful," Rosa said, gesturing toward Margaret's meticulously maintained garden. "Danny has been asking questions about the rose bushes by your fence. He's fascinated by how something can look so delicate but last through the winter." Margaret found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. "Those are David Austin roses," she said. "I planted them the year after I retired. They're quite hardy, despite appearances. Please tell Danny he's welcome to watch me work in the garden any time. It's nice to have someone interested in learning." This casual invitation blossomed into a gentle friendship that enriched Margaret's daily routine in unexpected ways. Danny would appear at her fence most afternoons after school, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, asking questions about everything from why leaves change color to how earthworms helped plants grow. His curiosity was infectious, and Margaret found herself seeing her own yard through his eyes, as a place of endless discovery rather than simply familiar territory. "Mrs. Chen," Danny asked one afternoon in late October, "did you always live alone in such a big house?" The question was innocent, delivered with the straightforward honesty that children possess before they learn that some topics require careful navigation. Margaret paused in her weeding, considering how to respond. She had become skilled over the years at deflecting questions about her solitary life, offering brief explanations that satisfied casual acquaintances without opening doors to deeper conversation. But something about Danny's genuine interest, combined with the golden afternoon light filtering through the maple trees, made her want to share more than her usual polite responses. "No, sweetheart," she said, settling back on her heels. "I had a companion for many years, a dog named Max. He was a golden retriever, about this tall when he sat up straight." She gestured with her hand, showing Danny the approximate height. "We walked together every morning, and he loved to lie in the sun right there by the rose bushes where you're standing now." Danny's eyes widened with interest. "Where is he now? Did he go to heaven?" Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied thoughts of Max, but found herself continuing the conversation rather than changing the subject. "I don't know, actually. He disappeared one morning when we were at the park. That was 11 years ago, and I never found out what happened to him." The boy absorbed this information with the seriousness that children reserve for stories about lost animals and missing pets. "My teacher says dogs are really good at finding their way home. Maybe he's still trying to come back." "Maybe he is," Margaret agreed, touched by the hopefulness in Danny's voice. This conversation marked the beginning of a ritual between them. Each afternoon, as Margaret worked in her garden, and Danny completed his homework at the picnic table his parents had placed in their backyard, they would talk about their respective days. Danny shared stories about school, friends, and the discoveries he made exploring the neighborhood, while Margaret found herself sharing memories that had been locked away for years. She told him about the walks she and Max used to take through Riverside Park, about the way Max would sit perfectly still while she read on their favorite bench, about his gentle manner with children and his inexplicable fear of butterflies. Danny listened to each story with the rapt attention of someone hearing fairy tales, asking follow-up questions that showed he understood the importance of these memories to the woman who shared them. "What did Max look like exactly?" Danny asked one afternoon in early November, as Margaret prepared her garden for winter. Margaret described Max in detail: his golden coat that grew lighter each year, his expressive amber eyes, the small scar on his left ear from a childhood accident, the way his tail would wag in perfect rhythm when he was particularly happy. She found unexpected comfort in speaking these details aloud, as if the act of description somehow made Max more real, more present in the world. Danny listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification about colors or sizes, and Margaret noticed that he seemed to be memorizing every detail she provided. When she asked him why he was so interested in learning about Max, Danny gave her a smile that was both innocent and mysteriously knowing. "I like dogs," he said simply, "and I think maybe if I know what Max looks like, I might see him someday. You said dogs are good at finding their way home, right?" Margaret felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years. Not quite hope, but perhaps the precursor to hope. "Yes, sweetheart, they certainly are." As winter settled over Cedar Falls and their afternoon conversations moved indoors to Margaret's warm kitchen, Danny continued to ask questions about Max with the persistent curiosity of a child on a mission. He wanted to know about Max's favorite foods, his sleeping habits, the games they used to play together. Margaret found herself retrieving photo albums she hadn't opened in years, showing Danny pictures of Max at different stages of his life. "He looks like he was really smart," Danny observed, studying a photograph of Max sitting attentively beside Margaret's chair at a neighborhood barbecue. "He was," Margaret agreed. "The smartest dog I've ever known. He understood things before I even said them sometimes, as if he could read my thoughts." Danny nodded seriously, as if this explanation made perfect sense to him. "Smart dogs remember everything," he said with the confidence of absolute certainty. "My dad says dogs never forget the people they love." Margaret smiled, touched by the boy's faith in the enduring power of love and memory. She couldn't have known, as she watched 7-year-old Danny Martinez carefully studying Max's photograph in the warm light of her kitchen, that his curiosity was about to become the key that would unlock a mystery that had remained hidden for over a decade. By the spring of 2019, Danny Martinez had established himself as the neighborhood's unofficial investigator of interesting mysteries and forgotten stories. His natural curiosity, combined with the kind of fearless exploration that comes with being 8 years old, had led him to discover hidden pathways between houses, abandoned tree forts in overgrown lots, and the stories behind every mysterious garden shed and forgotten corner of his new community. Margaret had grown accustomed to his afternoon visits, looking forward to their conversations with an anticipation that surprised her. Danny had a gift for drawing out memories she thought she'd buried, and his questions about Max had evolved from simple curiosity into something that resembled a gentle investigation. He would arrive at her back gate each day after school with new theories about where dogs might go when they disappear, or suggestions about places they hadn't thought to search. "Mrs. Chen," he said one particularly warm afternoon in May, "have you ever looked in all the garages around here? I mean, really looked?" Margaret paused in her planting, considering the question. "Well, we searched everywhere we could think of when Max first disappeared. The neighbors were very helpful. But what about the garages that are locked, or sheds that people don't use anymore?" Danny's voice carried the excitement of someone who believed he might have discovered something important. "My mom says there are lots of places in neighborhoods where people store things and then forget about them." The suggestion was innocent enough, but it stirred something in Margaret that had been dormant for years. The familiar flutter of possibility that she'd learned to suppress in order to function in daily life. She had indeed searched thoroughly in 2007, but her search had been limited to places where Max could reasonably be expected to wander on his own. The idea that he might have been confined somewhere, unable to return home, opened up possibilities she'd never fully considered. "That's a very thoughtful suggestion, Danny," she said carefully. "But it's been 12 years now. Even if Max had been trapped somewhere initially, he wouldn't still be there after all this time." Danny nodded seriously, but Margaret noticed a particular expression cross his face. The same look he got when he was working through a complex math problem or trying to understand a science concept that stretched his current knowledge. He was processing information in a methodical way that suggested he had more thoughts on the subject than he was ready to share. Over the following weeks, Margaret noticed that Danny's curiosity about the neighborhood had taken on a more focused quality. Instead of his usual random exploration, he seemed to be paying particular attention to the various outbuildings that dotted the residential streets around them. She would see him from her kitchen window, riding his bicycle slowly past houses with detached garages, his head turning to study each structure with the intensity of someone conducting a survey. When she mentioned this to Rosa Martinez during one of their occasional conversations over the fence, Rosa laughed affectionately. "Danny has decided he's going to solve every mystery in Cedar Falls," she said. "Last week he spent 3 hours trying to figure out why the Hendersons' fence has a gap in it. He's convinced there's a story behind everything." Margaret smiled, charmed by the boy's dedication to uncovering hidden truths, but she also felt a small stirring of concern. Danny's questions about Max had grown more specific over time, and she worried that his natural empathy was causing him to take on her grief as his own mission. She didn't want the weight of her loss to become a burden for such a young person to carry. But Danny seemed to sense her concern without needing it expressed directly. One afternoon, as they sat together on Margaret's back steps watching clouds move across the late spring sky, he turned to her with the kind of serious expression that made him seem older than his 8 years. "Mrs. Chen, I know you miss Max a lot," he said quietly. "My teacher says that sometimes when we care about someone, we keep hoping even when it seems impossible. She says that's not silly. It's brave." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected wisdom in his words. "Your teacher sounds very smart," She is. And she also says that sometimes answers come when we're not expecting them, but only if we keep paying attention to everything around us. Danny picked at a dandelion growing between the steps, his voice thoughtful. I pay attention to lots of things. It's like a game I play with myself. What kind of things do you notice? Margaret asked, genuinely curious about how the world looked through his observant eyes. Danny brightened, clearly pleased to share his observations. Well, like how Mr. Kowalski comes back to check on his old house every few months, even though he moved away. He just sits in his car and looks at it for about 10 minutes, then drives away. And Mrs. Patterson has been putting food on her back porch every night, but she doesn't have any pets. And there's a man on Elm Street who has a garage full of old bicycles, but I never see him riding any of them. Margaret listened with growing amazement at the detailed mental map Danny had created of their neighborhood's mysteries and patterns. His observations were precise, kindly curious rather than invasive, and surprisingly insightful for someone so young. You notice a lot more than most people do, she told him. That's a special gift. Danny nodded matter-of-factly, as if he'd already come to this conclusion himself. My dad says I notice things other people forget to look for. He says it's because I'm not in a hurry to get somewhere else all the time. This conversation stayed with Margaret as summer progressed, and Danny's systematic exploration of the neighborhood continued. She began to pay more attention to his observations, finding herself seeing familiar surroundings through his fresh eyes. The old man who sat on his porch at exactly the same time each evening. The family whose garage light had been flickering for months without anyone fixing it. The small details of community life that adults often overlook in their rush to manage larger responsibilities. But it was in late August, as summer was beginning its slow fade toward autumn, that Danny's gift for observation would finally converge with the mystery that had haunted Margaret for over a decade. On a Thursday afternoon that felt heavy with the promise of change, Danny appeared at Margaret's back gate with an expression she'd never seen before. Excitement mixed with something that looked almost like reverence. Mrs. Chen, he said, his voice carefully controlled but vibrating with barely contained energy. I think I found something you need to see. Margaret set down her watering can, recognizing in Danny's tone the same qualities she'd once heard in her own voice years earlier when she'd called neighbors to report Max's disappearance. It was the sound of someone who had stumbled across information too important to keep to themselves, but too fragile to handle carelessly. What did you find, sweetheart? She asked, her heart beginning to race in ways it hadn't for years. Danny looked directly into her eyes with the serious expression of someone about to change everything they both thought they knew about the world. I think, he said quietly, I might have found Max. Margaret's world seemed to tilt slightly off its axis as Danny's words settled between them in the warm August air. For a moment, she couldn't trust her own hearing, couldn't process what he'd said without feeling as though she might be falling into one of the dreams that had haunted her for over a decade. Dreams where Max had returned, only to dissolve like morning mist when she reached for him. Danny, she said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. What exactly did you see? The boy's expression remained serious, but she could see his hands trembling slightly with excitement and the weight of what he believed he'd discovered. There's a shed behind the old Peterson place on Elm Street, you know, where nobody lives anymore. It's been locked up for years, but yesterday I noticed something. Margaret's heart was racing now, but she forced herself to remain calm. Over the years, she'd followed up on dozens of potential sightings. Golden dogs glimpsed in passing cars, barking heard from distant yards, every hope eventually leading to the gentle disappointment of mistaken identity. She'd learned to manage her expectations while still allowing herself to feel hope. What did you notice? She asked. Danny took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts the way she'd seen him do when explaining complex discoveries. I was riding my bike past there on my way to Tyler Henderson's house, and I heard something. It was really faint, but it sounded like maybe whimpering, coming from inside the shed. Margaret felt her legs grow weak, and she sat down heavily on her back steps. The Peterson place had been empty for 3 years, since old Henry Peterson moved into assisted living. The property had been on the market intermittently, but the house needed significant repairs, and the large lot required more maintenance than most buyers wanted to take on. The sound could have been anything, sweetheart, Margaret said, though her voice carried less conviction than she'd intended. Whine through loose boards, settling wood. That's what I thought too, Danny said, sitting down beside her on the steps. But then I heard it again this morning when I rode past on my way to school, and Mrs. Chen... He paused, looking at her with eyes that seemed far older than his 8 years. It wasn't just whimpering. I heard scratching, like maybe something trying to get out. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to think rationally through the storm of emotions that Danny's words had unleashed. The Peterson property was only 6 blocks from Riverside Park, well within the range that Max could have traveled on his own. But the idea that he could have been confined there for over 12 years seemed impossible to accept. "Danny, you know that even if there is an animal in that shed, it couldn't be Max," she said gently. "It's been too long. No dog could survive." "What if someone has been taking care of him?" Danny interrupted, his words tumbling out with increasing urgency. "What if someone found him that day at the park and kept him, but they couldn't let him go home for some reason? What if he's been there all this time, waiting?" The scenario Danny painted was so specific, so carefully reasoned, that Margaret found herself considering possibilities she'd never allowed herself to contemplate. She'd always assumed that Max had either wandered off and gotten lost, been struck by a car, or perhaps been taken by someone who genuinely wanted to help him. The idea that he might have been deliberately confined, kept against his will, opened up darker possibilities that she preferred not to explore. "We need to call the police," she said finally. "If there's an animal in distress on that property, the authorities should investigate." Danny nodded eagerly. "But can we go look first? Just to see if we can see anything through the windows or gaps in the boards? If it's not Max, then we don't need to bother anyone. But if it is—" Margaret studied the boy's face, seeing in his expression the same desperate hope that had sustained her through the first terrible months after Max's disappearance. The rational part of her mind insisted that this was almost certainly another false lead, another heartbreak waiting to happen. But the part of her that had never stopped listening for collar tags, never stopped hoping, whispered that sometimes miracles disguise themselves as impossible coincidences. "All right," she said slowly. "But we don't go alone, and we don't try to open anything or go inside. We just look, and if we see anything concerning, we call the proper authorities immediately." Danny's face lit up with relief and excitement. "My dad gets home in an hour. He could come with us." Margaret nodded, grateful for David Martinez's steady presence. As a contractor, he would know how to assess the situation safely, and as a parent, he would ensure that Danny wasn't put in any danger by their investigation. The next hour passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret found herself unable to concentrate on any task, her mind cycling through every possible scenario that could explain what Danny had heard. She tried to prepare herself for disappointment, while simultaneously fighting against the hope that was building in her chest like pressure behind a dam. When David Martinez arrived home from work, Rosa and Danny met him in the driveway with an animated explanation of the afternoon's discovery. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as the family engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion, with Danny gesturing emphatically, while his parents listened with expressions of concern and growing curiosity. Within minutes, David was knocking on Margaret's back door, his work boots still covered in construction dust, and his expression carefully neutral. "Danny tells me you might want to check out the old Peterson place," he said without preamble. "Rosa and I think it's worth investigating, if you're up for it." Margaret grabbed her keys and cardigan, her hands shaking slightly as she locked her front door behind them. The walk to Elm Street took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like a journey through years of accumulated hope and grief. Danny chattered nervously as they walked, pointing out details of houses they passed, while David maintained the calm, practical manner of someone approaching a job that needed to be done carefully. The Peterson property sat on a corner lot, partially hidden behind overgrown hedges and a picket fence that had seen better days. The main house, a modest 2-story colonial, looked tired and abandoned, its windows dark and front porch cluttered with accumulated mail that no one had bothered to collect. But it was the small shed behind the house that drew their attention, a simple wooden structure with a pitched roof and no windows, set back against the property line where it was partially concealed by mature oak trees. "There," Danny whispered, pointing toward the shed. "That's where I heard the sounds." David approached the structure with the methodical assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating buildings for potential problems. He walked around the perimeter, checking the condition of the walls and foundation, testing the security of the door, which was indeed locked with a heavy padlock that looked relatively new. "The wood is in good condition," he reported quietly. "This shed has been maintained, unlike the house, and there are gaps between some of the boards here on the side." He knelt down, peering through a narrow opening near the ground. "I can't see much, but there's definitely something moving in there." Margaret felt her heart stop. "Moving?" David nodded, his expression growing more serious. "Something large enough to cast shadows. And there's a smell." He paused, his nose wrinkling. "Not unpleasant, but definitely organic, like an animal has been living in there for a long time." Danny had been standing perfectly still during his father's inspection, but now he moved closer to Margaret and took her hand with the instinctive comfort of someone who understood the magnitude of the moment they were experiencing. "Should we call the police now?" Margaret asked, her voice barely steady. David stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. "I think we should call animal control first. If there is an animal in there, they'll have the right equipment and training to handle the situation safely." He pulled out his cell phone. "But Margaret, I need you to understand that even if there is a dog in there, the chances that it's Max after all these years—" "I know," Margaret said quickly, though her heart was beating so fast she felt dizzy. "I know the odds. But I have to know. After all this time, I have to know." As David dialed the number for animal control, Danny squeezed Margaret's hand tighter. "No matter what we find," he said with the serious wisdom that had become his trademark, "at least we'll finally know the truth." Margaret nodded, looking down at the boy whose curiosity had led them to this moment of terrible, wonderful possibility. Whatever they discovered in the next hour would change everything she thought she knew about loss, hope, and the mysterious ways that love persists, even in the darkest circumstances. The sound of scratching came from within the shed, faint but unmistakable, and Margaret closed her eyes, sending up a silent prayer to whatever forces govern the reunion of hearts, separated by time and circumstance. Animal Control Officer Janet Mills had been responding to calls about confined animals for over 15 years. The something about Margaret Chen's trembling voice on the phone had prompted her to prioritize this particular case. She arrived at the Peterson property within 20 minutes, her white van equipped with the tools and cages necessary for whatever they might discover behind the locked shed door. Officer Mills was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen every possible scenario involving animals in distress. She listened carefully as David Martinez explained the situation, taking notes while Danny provided additional details about the sounds he'd heard over the past few days. "You said the property has been vacant for 3 years?" she asked, studying the shed with professional assessment. "That's right," Margaret confirmed, her voice barely steady. "Henry Peterson moved to Sunset Manor in 2020. The house has been on and off the market since then." Officer Mills walked around the structure, much as David had done earlier, but with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to identify signs of animal habitation. She paused at several points, kneeling to examine scratches in the wood near the base of the walls and sniffing carefully at the gaps between boards. "There's definitely an animal inside," she confirmed, after completing her circuit. "Based on the wear patterns around the door and the scratching marks, I'd say it's been here for quite some time. The question is how it's been surviving." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "Well, there would need to be a food and water source for any animal to survive long-term confinement," Officer Mills explained as she returned to her van to retrieve bolt cutters. "Which means either someone has been caring for whatever's in there, or there's another explanation we haven't considered yet." The padlock fell away with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the quiet afternoon. Officer Mills positioned herself carefully to one side of the door, motioning for the others to stay back. "Sometimes confined animals can be aggressive, even if they're normally gentle," she cautioned. "Let me assess the situation first." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as Officer Mills slowly pulled the door open, flooding the interior of the shed with afternoon sunlight for what might have been the first time in years. The smell that emerged was musty but not unpleasant, the scent of hay and wood shavings mixed with something undeniably canine. "Oh my God," Officer Mills whispered, her professional composure cracking slightly. This is not what I expected." From where she stood 15 feet away, Margaret could see into the shed's interior. What she discovered there would challenge everything she thought she understood about love, loss, and the lengths to which some people will go to hold on to what they cannot bear to release. The shed had been converted into a makeshift living space, complete with a raised wooden platform covered in blankets, food and water bowls that appeared to be regularly cleaned and refilled, and even a small battery-powered radio sitting on a shelf. But it was the occupant of this strange sanctuary that caused Margaret's world to shift on its axis. An elderly golden retriever sat in the far corner, his coat matted and dulled with age, but his amber eyes still bright with intelligence. He was thin but not malnourished, obviously cared for but confined, and when he saw the strangers at his door, his tail began a tentative wag that spoke of a spirit that had not been broken despite years of captivity. Margaret felt her legs give way, and she sank to her knees in the grass, her hands pressed to her mouth as tears she'd held back for over a decade finally spilled free. The dog in the shed was older, grayer, and bore the marks of years she'd missed, but she would have recognized those gentle eyes anywhere. "Max," she whispered, and the dog's ears perked up at the sound of his name spoken in a voice he'd never forgotten. Officer Mills emerged from the shed with the dog walking slowly beside her, his movements careful but steady. As they approached Margaret, Max's pace quickened slightly, his nose working to process scents that carried the promise of home. When he reached her, he lowered his head and pressed it against her shoulder with the same gentle gesture he'd used to comfort her during thunderstorms years ago. "I can't believe it," David Martinez said quietly. "After all these years, he's really here." Danny stood transfixed, watching the reunion with the wide-eyed wonder of someone witnessing a miracle. "Mrs. Chen, he remembers you," he said with absolute certainty. "Look how happy he is." Margaret buried her face in Max's familiar coat, feeling the solid warmth of him against her hands, and knowing with absolute certainty that this was no dream. He was thinner than she remembered, his muzzle completely white now, and his movement spoke of advanced age, but his gentle spirit remained unchanged. "Ma'am," Officer Mills said gently, "I need to ask you some questions, and I'm afraid there are some serious legal issues we need to address here." Margaret looked up, still holding Max close, suddenly remembering that someone had been responsible for keeping him confined all these years. "Who did this? Who's been keeping him here?" Officer Mills consulted her notes. "According to county records, this property is owned by Henry Peterson, who's currently at Sunset Manor. But someone has clearly been maintaining this setup for years. This isn't neglect. This is deliberate confinement with care. Someone has been feeding this dog, cleaning his space, even providing entertainment." She gestured toward the radio. "The question is who, and why?" David had been quietly examining the shed's exterior, while Margaret reunited with Max. "There's a path worn in the grass," he reported. "Someone has been coming here regularly, probably at least once a day, for a very long time. And look at this." He pointed to a small calendar hanging inside the shed, with dates marked in careful handwriting. "Feeding schedule, vet visits, even what looks like exercise times." The implications of these discoveries settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Someone had not only taken Max 12 years ago, but had kept him confined while maintaining the pretense that he was missing. Someone had watched Margaret's anguish, had seen the missing dog posters, had observed her solitary walks through the park where she and Max had spent so many happy mornings together. "I need to call the police," Officer Mills said grimly. "This isn't just animal confinement. This is theft, and possibly elder abuse if Mr. Peterson isn't aware of what's been happening on his property." Margaret continued to hold Max, but her mind was racing with questions that demanded answers. Who had taken him from the park that morning in 2007? How had they managed to keep him hidden for so long? And perhaps most importantly, why had they chosen to confine him rather than simply keeping him as their own pet? "Mrs. Chen," Danny said quietly, "do you think Max knows how long he's been gone?" Margaret looked into Max's eyes, seeing in them the same patient wisdom she remembered, tempered now by years of experiences she couldn't imagine. "I think dogs understand time differently than we do," she said softly. "Maybe for him it feels like I was just away for a very long while, and now I'm back." Max's tail wagged slightly at the sound of her voice, and he settled more comfortably against her side, as if confirming her theory. Despite everything he'd endured, despite the years of confinement and separation, his capacity for love and trust remained intact. Officer Mills had stepped away to make her phone calls, and Margaret could hear her speaking in the clipped, professional tones of someone reporting a crime. Police would be arriving soon, followed by investigators who would work to uncover the truth about who had stolen 12 years of life from both Margaret and Max. But for now, in the late afternoon sunshine of an August day that had started like any other, Margaret Chen held her beloved companion and marveled at the persistence of love, the unexpected nature of miracles, and the curious way that answers sometimes come disguised as the observations of an 8-year-old boy who noticed everything the adults had learned to overlook. The police arrived within the hour, transforming the quiet corner lot into a scene of official investigation that drew curious neighbors from houses throughout the area. Detective Rebecca Walsh, a woman in her 40s with the methodical approach of someone who had learned that the most shocking crimes often hid behind facades of ordinary respectability, took charge of the scene with calm efficiency. Margaret remained seated on the grass with Max, reluctant to let him out of her sight even for the medical examination that Officer Mills insisted was necessary. The veterinarian who arrived with the police, Dr. Sarah Martinez, the same woman who had taken over Max's original vet's practice, approached them with gentle professionalism. "Mrs. Chen, I know this must be overwhelming," Dr. Martinez said as she knelt beside them, "but I need to examine Max to assess his health and gather evidence about his care during these missing years." The examination revealed a dog who had been consistently fed and provided with basic medical care, though not the comprehensive veterinary attention that Margaret had always ensured. Max was underweight but not malnourished. His teeth showed signs of age but no serious neglect, and while he moved slowly, his mobility was remarkable for a dog who would now be approximately 30 years old, an age few golden retrievers ever reach. "Someone has been taking care of him," Dr. Martinez confirmed quietly. "This level of health preservation doesn't happen by accident. Whoever kept him confined understood basic animal care." While the veterinary examination continued, Detective Walsh began her investigation of the shed itself. She photographed every detail: the carefully maintained feeding station, the calendar with its meticulous notations, the small stockpile of dog food stored in sealed containers, and the collection of worn toys that suggested someone had tried to provide Max with mental stimulation during his captivity. "Mrs. Chen," Detective Walsh said, approaching Margaret with a notebook full of initial observations, "I need to ask you some questions about the day Max disappeared. I know it was 12 years ago, but any details you can remember might help us understand how this situation developed." Margaret recounted that October morning in 2007 with the clarity that trauma often preserves in memory. She described their normal routine, the exact location where she'd been sitting when Max wandered away, the thoroughness of the search that followed, and the complete absence of witnesses who had seen Max leave the park with anyone. "Did you know Henry Peterson personally?" Detective Walsh asked. "Only by reputation," Margaret replied. "He was a quiet man who kept to himself. I knew he had lived on that property for decades, but we weren't neighbors who spoke regularly." Detective Walsh made notes, then shared information that sent a chill through Margaret's understanding of what had happened. "Mr. Peterson is 87 years old and has been living with advancing dementia since 2018. When I spoke with the staff at Sunset Manor, they confirmed that he has occasional visits from his nephew, Robert Peterson, who has been managing his uncle's affairs and property maintenance." The implication hung in the air like a storm cloud gathering force. Someone with regular access to Henry Peterson's property had been using the old man's shed to confine Max, possibly for over a decade. Danny Martinez, who had been listening intently to every word of the investigation, suddenly spoke up with the clarity of someone who had been processing information carefully. "Detective Walsh, there's something else you should know." The adults turned to look at the 8-year-old who had started this entire discovery. Danny's expression was serious, but Margaret could see the excitement of someone who had just connected important pieces of a puzzle. "I've been riding my bike around the neighborhood a lot," Danny continued, "and I've seen a man coming to check on the Peterson house pretty regularly. He drives a green pickup truck, and he always goes around to the back of the property instead of using the front door." Detective Walsh leaned forward with interest. "Can you describe this man?" "He's older, maybe like my grandpa's age, with gray hair. He always wears work clothes, like my dad's construction clothes. And he usually comes on weekdays in the afternoon, when most people are at work." Margaret felt pieces clicking together in her mind. Someone had been systematically visiting the Peterson property. Someone who knew the routines of the neighborhood well enough to avoid detection. Someone who had access to the property through family connections, but was using that access for purposes the property owner couldn't consent to or even understand. "Danny," Detective Walsh said gently, "when was the last time you saw this man?" Danny thought carefully. "Maybe 3 days ago?" "He was there for about an hour, and I saw him carrying something that looked like a bag of dog food from his truck to the backyard." Detective Walsh immediately radioed for officers to be on the lookout for a green pickup truck in the vicinity, and she dispatched additional units to Sunset Manor to speak with Henry Peterson's caretakers about his nephew's visit patterns and access to property keys. Margaret found herself processing emotions she couldn't have prepared for. Relief at Max's return warred with anger at whoever had stolen 12 years of their life together, while gratitude for Danny's observational skills mixed with sorrow for all the time that had been lost. Max seemed to sense her emotional turmoil, pressing closer against her side with the intuitive comfort that had always been his gift. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Martinez said, completing her examination, "I'd like to take Max to the clinic for some additional tests and to make sure he's stable for the transition back to normal life. Given his age and the unusual circumstances, we need to monitor him carefully." The thought of being separated from Max again, even temporarily, caused Margaret's throat to tighten with panic. But she understood the necessity of ensuring his health after such a traumatic discovery. "Can I stay with him?" she asked. "Of course. In fact, I'd recommend it. The bond between you is obviously still strong, and that will be crucial for his emotional recovery." As Officer Mills prepared to transport Max to the veterinary clinic, Detective Walsh received a radio call that caused her expression to grow grim. She stepped away to respond, then returned with information that would finally begin to explain the mystery that had haunted Margaret for over a decade. "We've located Robert Peterson," she announced. "He was arrested 20 minutes ago when he returned to the property in his green pickup truck. He had dog food, fresh water containers, and what appears to be medication for an elderly dog in his vehicle." Margaret felt a mixture of vindication and heartbreak wash over her. After 12 years of wondering, of hoping, of grieving a loss she could never fully understand, the truth was finally beginning to emerge. "What happens now?" she asked. Detective Walsh's expression was compassionate but serious. "Now we get answers. And we make sure that whoever is responsible for taking Max and 12 years of your life together faces the full consequences of their actions." As they prepared to leave the Peterson property, Margaret took one last look at the shed that had been Max's prison for so many years. Despite the relief of his rescue, she knew that the emotional journey of understanding what had happened and why was just beginning. 3 weeks after Max's rescue, Margaret Chen's house on Maple Street had been transformed into a gentle recovery center, where time seemed to move at the measured pace of healing. The veterinary tests had confirmed what Dr. Martinez suspected. Max was remarkably healthy for a dog of his advanced age, a testament to someone's consistent, if misguided, care during his years of captivity. The legal proceedings had unfolded with the methodical thoroughness that serious crimes demand. Robert Peterson, Henry's 58-year-old nephew, had been charged with theft, animal confinement, and elder abuse for using his uncle's property without consent. During police interviews, he had finally revealed the full scope of his actions, painting a picture of obsession and mental illness that had stolen 12 years from both Margaret and Max. According to his confession, Robert had encountered Max at Riverside Park on that October morning in 2007, when the dog had wandered away from Margaret's usual spot while investigating something in the woods. Instead of helping Max find his way back to his obvious owner, Robert had seen an opportunity to address his own crushing loneliness following his wife's death the previous year. He said Max reminded him of a dog he'd had as a child. Detective Walsh had explained to Margaret during one of their follow-up meetings. He convinced himself that keeping Max would help him cope with his grief, but he knew taking someone's pet was wrong, so he hid him at his uncle's property where no one would think to look. The story revealed layers of selfishness and self-deception that Margaret found difficult to comprehend. Robert had watched her search desperately for Max, had seen the missing dog posters throughout the neighborhood, had even spoken with Margaret at community events where she mentioned her lost companion. Yet he had maintained the pretense of concern while visiting Max in secret, creating an elaborate routine of care that satisfied his need for companionship while keeping his crime hidden. "The calendar we found documents every visit for over a decade," Detective Walsh had continued. "He fed Max twice daily, brought him toys, even played a radio for company. In his mind, he was providing a good life. He seemed genuinely unable to understand the suffering he was causing both you and Max." Margaret had listened to these explanations with the complex emotions of someone whose worst fears and greatest hopes had been simultaneously confirmed. Max had not died alone or suffered abandonment, but he had been deliberately kept from coming home for reasons that defied any reasonable understanding of love or compassion. Now, as autumn settled over Cedar Falls with the same golden light that had marked Max's disappearance 16 years earlier, Margaret was learning to navigate the strange territory of recovered joy. Max had adapted to freedom with the resilience that had sustained him through captivity, but his advanced age meant that their reunited time together would be measured in months rather than years. His favorite spot had become the sunny corner of Margaret's living room where he could observe the neighborhood through the large front window. He would lie there for hours, watching the patterns of daily life with the patient attention of someone who had learned to find contentment in small observations. His tail would wag whenever he saw Danny Martinez arrive home from school, and he had developed a particular fondness for the afternoon conversations that continued through Margaret's open window. "How is Max feeling today?" Danny would ask each afternoon, his face appearing at the window with the reliable punctuality that had become one of the highlights of Margaret's day. "He's having a good day," Margaret would typically respond, and she was usually telling the truth. Despite everything he had endured, Max's capacity for simple happiness remained intact. He enjoyed gentle walks around the block, brief visits to their old bench at Riverside Park, and the luxury of sleeping beside Margaret's bed, where he could hear her breathing through the night. Dr. Martinez had prepared Margaret for the reality that Max's years of confinement had likely shortened his remaining lifespan, but she had also emphasized the remarkable spirit that had allowed him to survive such an unusual ordeal. "He's lived through something that would have broken many animals," she had said during one of their regular checkups. "The fact that he's maintained his gentle nature and his bond with you speaks to an extraordinary resilience." The community's response to Max's story had been overwhelming. The local newspaper had run a feature article about his rescue, focusing on Danny's observational skills and the importance of paying attention to details that adults often overlook. Neighbors who had participated in the original search efforts 12 years earlier stopped by to see Max and share their amazement at his return. Linda Henderson, whose own boys had grown from 8-year-olds to young men attending college, visited one afternoon with tears in her eyes. "I remember when Max first disappeared," she said, gently stroking his graying head. "The boys were so upset, and we all hoped he would find his way home somehow. I never imagined it would take 16 years, or that the answer would come from another little boy who cared enough to pay attention." Margaret had been moved by these visits, by the way Max's story had reminded the entire community about the enduring power of hope and the unexpected ways that missing pieces of our lives sometimes find their way back to us. But it was her daily interactions with Danny Martinez that provided the deepest satisfaction, watching the boy who had rescued Max develop his own understanding of what his discovery meant. "Mrs. Chen," Danny had asked one afternoon as they sat together watching Max sleep in his patch of sunlight, "do you think Max remembers being taken away, or just remembers being home with you?" Margaret considered the question with the care it deserved. "I think Max lives in the present more than we do," she said finally. "He remembers love, and he recognizes home, but I don't think he carries anger about the time that was taken from him. Dogs seem to have a gift for forgiveness that we could all learn from." Danny nodded thoughtfully. "My mom says forgiveness doesn't mean that what happened was okay. It just means you don't let the bad thing keep hurting you forever." "Your mother is very wise," Margaret agreed, struck by the profound simplicity of the observation. As October 15th approached, the anniversary of Max's disappearance, Margaret found herself reflecting on the strange mathematics of loss and recovery. 16 years had passed since that terrible morning when she'd looked up from her book to find Max gone. 12 of those years had been shaped by his absence, by the daily weight of not knowing what had happened to the companion who had shared her life for so long. But now, watching Max sleep peacefully in the home where he belonged, Margaret understood that the story she thought had ended in 2007 had actually been suspended, waiting for a curious 8-year-old boy to notice sounds that no one else had thought to investigate. The evening light was beginning to fade when Max stirred from his nap and approached Margaret's chair with the slow dignity of age. She reached down to stroke his head, feeling the familiar softness of his ears and the solid warmth that confirmed his presence was real, not another dream that would dissolve with morning. "We're home, boy," she whispered, and Max's tail offered a gentle wag of agreement. Outside her window, Danny Martinez was teaching a younger neighbor how to ride a bicycle, his patient voice carrying instructions and encouragement across the golden afternoon. Margaret smiled, recognizing in the boy's careful attention to a child's needs the same observational gift that had brought Max home. Some stories, she reflected, end exactly where they began, but transformed by time, love, and the mysterious ways that hope persists, even when we can no longer see its purpose. Max had found his way back to her, not through his own efforts, but through the kindness of a child who noticed everything and believed that every mystery deserved to be solved. As darkness settled over Cedar Falls and the first stars appeared in the October sky, Margaret Chen sat beside her sleeping dog and marveled at the extraordinary ordinary miracle of being home together at last. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, including the probability that their time together was shorter than either of them would choose. But tonight, in the gentle rhythm of Max's breathing and the familiar sounds of a neighborhood settling into evening peace, she found a contentment that had been missing from her life for 16 years. The story of Max's disappearance had finally found its proper ending, not with dramatic rescue or impossible coincidence, but with the quiet observation of a boy who understood that love never stops looking for a way home. If stories like Margaret's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the love between faithful companions continues to endure, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart, because sometimes the most extraordinary miracles hide in the most ordinary moments, waiting for someone who cares enough to pay attention.